You have just subscribed to Planning Motion and want to create your first trip. In this video, we will build together a trip from scratch. As I mentioned in the first video of this Planning Motion Getting Started guide, there's no one way to plan your trips. So the trip we are going to build together isn't a method as such, nor it is a one-size-fits-all approach. It's an example of trip planning to show you how to use the different planning tools available. When you access Planning Motion for the first time, after having subscribed and created your password, you arrive on the trip page. And to create your first trip, you click on this orange button with the plus sign, Create a New Trip. We give it a name, Trip to France. It is a 16 days trip starting October 1st. Since I've indicated the number of days, the end date of the trip is calculated. If I change the end date, the number of days will be updated. I'm not going to enter a specific time at the moment. In fact, there's very little that's required or set as default in Planning Motion. The application gives you a lot of flexibility to plan the way you want. You can just plan the broad outlines of your trip or prepare everything down to the last detail. It's really up to you. You can also always come back later to add information when you're ready to add it if you want to. Next, here the default currency is shown in US dollars. I'd prefer euros for this trip. So to change it, I click in the box, delete USD, then type EUR, the code appears, and I select it. That's all I'm going to add for now. We will come back to it later. I click on Save, and my trip is created. I can start planning it. I'm now in the trip page. Here are the departure and return points of my trip. It's often our home address that we enter in the departure and return points, but for this trip, as I'm flying to Paris, I will indicate Paris, France as starting point to plan the road trip in France, and leaving the return point empty for now. We saw in the first video of the Getting Started guide how to view our itinerary on a map, on the calendar, and on the expenses page. To view the itinerary, you first need to add stages to your trip. To add a stage, as for the trip, I click on the orange plus button. As we saw in the first video, there are two types of stages in Planning Motion. I'm going to start by adding a stage with an overnight stay. For the trip to France, I will keep Paris for last. Our first destination is Honfleur. I'm naming it, and here, for the stage location, I'm also indicating Honfleur, and I'm also going to specify that it is in France. It's what we enter here that is used to create the itinerary in Google Maps. So I need to help Google Maps to identify the actual location by adding the province, state, or country in addition to the city name. So this is the first stage of the trip. I'm arriving there on October 2nd and will be staying for one night. To finalize the creation of the stage, I click on Save. I'll be adding two more stages straight away, Bayeux and Mont-Saint-Michel. I have found a place to stay in Bayeux, l'Hôtel Le Lion d'Or. To add an accommodation to the Bayeux stage, I click on the orange plus button. I write its name, Hôtel Le Lion d'Or. I have the hotel's website in this tab of my browser. I copy the website address. I go back to Planning Motion, and I paste it here. If I want my link to be clickable, I simply add a space at the end, and if I click on it, I have direct access to the website. I go back to the hotel's website tab to find the address. Here, I copy it, go back to Planning Motion, and paste the address in Specify Location to create itinerary, as this address will be used to create the itinerary in Google Maps. I could also enter a GPS coordinate instead of an address. For example, for a location where you can't find the address, such as a private street or a forest road. That's all I'm going to add to my accommodation for now. We'll come back to it later to add more information. Save. We'll go to the maps page here to see the itinerary from what I have added so far. I have several options here. First, we'll go to Google Maps to see the itinerary. Here I have the list of stages I've added so far. I also have accommodation for Bayeux, which I can select if I want rather than the stage. Here at the bottom of the list, I click on Create Map, then on View My Itinerary, and there, all the addresses I've entered in Planning Motion are transferred into Google Maps. Now I can see the itinerary that Google Maps suggests. But I know that I have a Mont Saint-Michel stage in Planning Motion and I don't see it here on the map. I go back to Planning Motion, click on Stages to return to the list of stages. I click on Mont Saint-Michel and realize that I haven't entered anything here. And that's why the Mont Saint-Michel stage doesn't appear on the map. So I enter Mont Saint-Michel, specify France, I click on Map, Google, create the map, see my itinerary. Well, now I also have Mont Saint-Michel. In Google Maps, to see the distances and estimated times between stages, I just need to click on Details to access the mileage and estimated time between stages. Because in France they use kilometers, it is by default indicated in kilometers in Google Maps. But while preparing your road trip, if you like, you can change it to miles. You can do so by clicking Options here and selecting miles. So here in Details, between Paris and Honfleur, I have the mileage and estimated travel time. What I like to do is take this information and add it to the destination stage. I click on Honfleur stage information, and here I can add miles and estimated time to the name of my stage. By the way, anything I add to Planning Motion can be modified. As in this case, I have modified the stage name by adding miles or kilometers and the duration of the leg. Now, let's see how the trip is built in the calendar. Okay, I can see right away that I've set the same date for Honfleur and Bayeux. I simply move Bayeux to the next day in the calendar. I plan to stay for 1 night in Honfleur and 2 nights in Bayeux. I can double-click the stage Bayeux in the calendar to go directly to the form of that stage. There, I can change the number of days. Going back to the calendar, Bayeux is now over 2 days. And I already know we want to spend the last 4 days of the trip in Paris. So if I click on the empty box on the 12th, the day that I'm returning to Paris, I'm going straight to the creation of the new stage, and the date is already there since I've clicked on the October 12th box in the calendar. So I can just adjust the number of days to 4. At this point, you may think that I'm moving very quickly from the map to the calendar to the list of stages, but that's because it's actually very easy to navigate from one place to another in the app. You'll see that in no time, you too will be able to navigate from one place to another without hesitation. Okay, so we've added stages and accommodation, so we are going to see now how to add activities. There are 2 ways to add activities in Planning Motion. Let's start with a place we're going to visit when we are in Bayeux. I'm in the calendar. I double-click on the stage Bayeux. In the stage, there is the activity section. I can click on the orange button with the plus. I found the information on the Normandy American Cemetery on Google Maps. I like to copy and paste, so I select Normandy American Cemetery, and I will paste it in the name of my activity. I will also copy the website, and here I have the address. In Google Maps, when I click on this icon, it copies the address, and then I paste it in planning motion. I could save and continue later, but first we'll just take a few seconds to add also just below the place where we just entered the address for the itinerary in Google Maps. We will add the GPS coordinates that will be used to transfer your planning to apps like Maps.me, Google My Maps, or even your Garmin GPS. These two fields don't serve the same purpose. This one is used to obtain the itinerary in Google Maps. You can enter a city name, an address, even GPS coordinates. The important thing is that Google Maps identifies the location. In the field just below, you can only enter GPS coordinates. And this is used to transfer your planning to mapping applications such as Maps.me and Google My Maps. So, to find a GPS coordinate in Google Maps, if I put the cursor on the location, here, the Normandy American Cemetery, and right-click, a little window opens and displays the GPS coordinate of this location. I click on the coordinate, and it's automatically copied. Back to planning motion, paste it here. It's that simple. For everything I add to my planning, I've made a habit of always entering at least one address and its GPS coordinates. It doesn't take long, and it opens up a whole range of options when it comes to using the tools available in planning motion. So we've just seen how to add an activity within a stage, but sometimes you plan to do activities along the way, on the way from one stage to another. In such cases, I use one of Planning Motion's tools, which is very flexible, the stop. On our way to Mont Saint-Michel, we wanted to stop for a visit to the medieval city of Dinant. In Planning Motion, to add a stop, I click on Create a New Stage and choose Stop. I go to the other tab in my browser and I copy Dinant and paste it here in Planning Motion. And of course, you surely are starting to get the idea. I copy and paste the other basic information, which I always like to have easily available. I do it once, and then I know where to find it. All in the same place in Planning Motion. And I need to add a date for this stop to keep the right chronology of my itinerary. A stop can also be used to force a detour on an itinerary. It can be used to enter a port of call on a cruise. It can be used for all sorts of things. It's a very flexible planning tool. Okay, so far we've seen how to add stages, stops, activities, accommodations. What are also usually planned for a trip are transportation means. Here, next to the stage button, is the button for accessing the transportation page. We can add our plane tickets, train tickets, all our tickets of any kind of transportation. Here again, I click on the orange button to add my ticket. I give it a name. Once saved, I can add the transport segments of this ticket by clicking on the plus. In the transportation section, you can also add a vehicle rental. To add expenses for gas or toll charges for the rental vehicle, or if you're using your own vehicle, you can add them in the travel kit section. In the travel kit section, you can add all other things you want to plan. By clicking on the orange button, I can choose a category. there are different categories for travel documents, health insurance, and transportation expenses for gas and tolls, as well as meals. In fact, all the other things I want to prepare for my trip. In the first video of this Getting Started Guide series, we saw the expenses page, the planning statuses, the currency page, the travel book, and the notebook. So we won't go into those again here. But what I'd like to do now is show you how, once you've created a stage, an accommodation, an activity, or anything else, you can always modify, move, duplicate, and reuse what you've added to your planning without having to start all over. So let's continue with planning our trip. At some point in our trip, we want to go to the Bourgogne, the Burgundy region. I had already prepared the stage in my notebook. So I go into the notebook. Here in the search field, I type Bourgogne. I find the Châteauneuf-en-Auxois stage. I select my trip to France. Copy in this trip. I enter the date. Now everything I had prepared and noted in my notebook for the Bourgogne stage is now copied entirely into my trip. And now I see after adding this stage that I have a new warning. So I'm going to take this opportunity to show you what the warnings are for in Planning Motion. On the warnings page, Planning Motion tells me if there are any inconsistencies in the schedule. As here, the arrival and departure dates for the Bourgogne stage are after the trip end date. To remove these warnings, you simply have to change what's wrong. So I go to the calendar and I simply move the stage to October 8th. If I go back to my warnings, it's no longer there. I have no more warnings. Warnings indicate inconsistencies. They can be useful to see, for example, that we have planned to be in two different places at the same time, but warnings don't keep us from continuing to plan our trip. They don't create errors either. If that's how you want to plan your trip, the warning will simply stay there and it will not block you from continuing with your travel plans. So, we've seen that we can transfer what we've prepared in the notebook from the notebook to a trip. In the same way, we can transfer something from one trip to another trip. Let me show you. Here is a trip shared by another Planning Motion user. What interests me about this trip is the Colmar stage, which I would like to add to my trip to France. It includes many activities that we want to do in and around Colmar, like all those villages that we can visit in a day trip from Colmar. There is one thing I usually do when I take a stage from one trip and send it onto another trip. I first like to duplicate the stage. I click on the orange square with the 3 small dots. We will see all these options in more details in a moment. I click on duplicate and a copy of the stage is created. I click on the copy of the stage. Here it says stage of trip. And if I click on the name of the trip, a menu appears listing all my trips. I select the trip I'm planning, trip to France, and the stage I have just duplicated is transferred to my trip to France. I can change the name of the stage and eventually change the date. As you have seen so far, Planning Motion offers many possibilities, many tools that you can use or not, depending on the kind of trip you are planning. There's one thing I always come across when preparing my trips, and that is files. Inevitably, there's going to be a PDF file of a reservation, a picture of a map that I'm going to want to keep, that I'm going to want to add to my planning. For every stage, accommodation, activity, in fact, for everything I add to my trip, there's a Note and Document section. At the bottom of each of these sections, there's this Browse button. Clicking on that button lets me select a file on my computer to add to Planning Motion. For example, here, for this accommodation, I can add up to 5 files. You can add up to 5 files up to 5 megabytes each, wherever you find this button. Clicking on the pencil here takes me to the trip page where I initially created my trip. Here, I can change the name of my trip, the dates, I can add notes, I have options, I can even make checklists. Same thing in the comments section. I have the Browse button here too to add files. And here, I can invite someone to follow my trip. It allows me to invite someone to view the entire planning of my trip. We can invite our travel partners, our parents, our children. This person or these people will be able to see the trip and everything in it, but they won't be able to modify anything. Now, let's go back to the trip page and I'll show you the date change tool. So here is the trip to France that we are planning for October 2024. Suppose we decide to postpone this trip to 2025. We want to do the exact same trip, but in September 2025. Most of the time, before making big changes like this, I usually duplicate my trip first. That way, I have an original copy of my trip with all the information as it was before I made the changes. If I change the start date, so September 2025, and let's say we leave on the 2nd, when I click on Plan this trip, a window opens with explanations and asking me to make a choice. Clicking on OK means that I ask Planning Motion to also change all the dates of my stages and stops to keep the same chronology so that I have the exact same trip, but in September 2025. I can change the name. I click on the pencil and add 2025 to the name of my trip. If I had selected the other option of the date change tool, the dates of the stops and stages would not have been modified. This can be useful when you just want to add a few days to the beginning of a trip to add a new stage without modifying the rest of the trip. Now, let's take a closer look at all the options available in the orange square with the 3 small dots, the button we have just used to duplicate our trip. You'll find this orange button with 3 small dots throughout the app. This button gives you access to a number of options. This first one is quite simple. If I click on Save, it saves the changes I've just made. But let me take a moment to show you an interesting option. Here, I decide to change the name of the Colmar stage to add the region name. As soon as I have changed something in my stage, this round arrow appears. If I click on this arrow, everything I have just modified is cancelled. And if I rewrite Alsace and leave without saving, instead of losing everything, the changes are saved automatically. We can, amongst Planning Motion users, share trips prepared with the app. One way to do this is to use the Send option. If you know the email address the person uses to connect to Planning Motion, you can send it directly to that person. For instance, I'm in a stage. I can send only that stage with everything it contains, including accommodations and activities. If I want to send the entire trip, I click on the pencil icon here. I find myself in the page of all my trips, and using the orange button with the 3 little dots, it's the entire trip that I'm going to send to the other user, except for the files I have uploaded and the content of the reservation sections where there are prices and reservation numbers. but everything else will be included. In the same way, a user can send you his trip plan directly. At that point, you receive a notification here at the top by clicking on the little bell. You find your notifications and you can accept or refuse. Obviously, we made tutorials which are on Planning Motion's YouTube channel to explain in details how to share a trip and how to adapt a trip prepared by another user and make it your own. In addition to sending your trip to a specific person, you can likewise share a link on Planning Motion's trip sharing forum or on your blog, on your social media, wherever you like. When a Planning Motion user clicks on that shared link, a copy of the trip is added to their account. We've seen that you can transfer the notes from your notebook to a trip you're preparing. You can also send a stage, for example, from a trip to your notebook. As we saw earlier, you can duplicate, and we also have the option of deleting. When you click on delete, a window opens to ask you if this is what you want to do, because this deletion is definitive and cannot be undone. And if the confirmation window doesn't appear, it's because a setting in your browser is blocking it from opening. That is one of the reasons why the next video in the Getting Started Guide series is so important to watch. In it, I explain the 2 browser settings you should verify to ensure you have access to all Planning Motion features. You need to allow new windows to open and also disable automatic translation. Let's take a look together at the last video of the Getting Started Guide series. See you there.